June 19th, 1944, 140 miles northwest of Guam. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vraciu pressed his face against the canopy of his Grumman F6F Hellcat, staring at what seemed impossible. Below him, silhouetted against the cobalt Pacific, flew what he would later describe as a swarm of bees. 50 Japanese dive bombers in tight formation, heading directly toward Task Force 58. In the 8 minutes that followed, Vraciu would shoot down 6 enemy aircraft using only 360 rounds of ammunition, 60 rounds per kill. When he landed back on the USS Lexington, grinning and holding up 6 fingers for the photographers, he embodied a truth that Japanese naval commanders were only beginning to comprehend. Their elite corps of naval aviators, the men who had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating precision, who had driven Allied forces across the Pacific in 1941 and 1942, no longer existed. What remained were boys with barely enough flight hours to find their carriers, flying into a slaughter that would forever be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The young pilots diving toward the American fleet that morning had received an average of 200 flight hours of training in early 1944. By late 1944, many would graduate with only 40 hours of actual flight time. Their American opponents had logged over 500 hours before ever seeing combat. This single disparity in numbers would tell the story of June 19, 1944 better than any tactical analysis. Japan's fatal assumption that quality could never be mass-produced was about to collide with American industrial reality. The Japanese had run out of trained pilots, and everyone who watched the sky that day would know it. The crisis had been building since June 4, 1942, when 4 Japanese fleet carriers went to the bottom at Midway. In a single day, Japan lost 110 combat-experienced pilots. These were not replacements fresh from training schools. These were the veteran aviators who had perfected their craft over China, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, who represented thousands of flight hours that could never be recovered. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war with approximately 3,500 trained pilots, of whom 1,500 to 1,750 were carrier qualified. Their training infrastructure, inherited from rigid pre-war standards, was never designed to replace losses at wartime rates. Before Pearl Harbor, acceptance into Japanese naval pilot training was extraordinarily selective. Out of 1,500 applicants to the pilot trainee system in 1937, only 70 were accepted. Of those 70, only 25 graduated. The training itself consumed years. A typical Japanese naval aviator completing the program in 1941 had logged between 600 and 800 flight hours over a period stretching up to 4 years. They practiced formation flying until it became instinct. They drilled aerial gunnery until they could lead a moving target without conscious thought. They learned navigation over open ocean using only compass, chronometer, and dead reckoning. By the time they reached operational squadrons, they were among the finest pilots in the world. The problem was scale. The entire Japanese pilot training infrastructure was designed to produce several hundred pilots annually in peacetime, with no more than 100 candidates accepted in some years before 1940. This number represented the peacetime assessment of how many pilots would be needed to replace normal attrition, handle expansion, and maintain quality standards. The concept that Japan might lose hundreds of pilots in single battles, month after month, year after year, never entered pre-war planning. Japanese naval doctrine was built on the decisive battle, the one climactic engagement that would destroy the enemy fleet and end the war. Pilot training programs reflected this assumption: quality over quantity, individual excellence over mass production. The Americans had taken a fundamentally different approach. Even before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy had begun expanding pilot training to wartime levels. The Civilian Pilot Training Program, initiated in 1939, created a pool of men with basic flying skills who could transition into military training faster than complete beginners. When war came, America could draw on this reservoir while simultaneously expanding training facilities at a pace that would have seemed impossible to Japanese planners. By 1943, the United States was producing over 20,000 naval aviators annually, with 20,842 graduates that year alone. The Americans had standardized training into an 18-month program that moved students through primary, intermediate, and advanced phases with factory precision. Flight schools appeared across the country, with facilities like Naval Air Station, Pensacola, and others processing thousands of pilots. Instructors rotated back from combat, bringing frontline experience into the training curriculum. This infrastructure was designed not just to produce pilots, but to produce them in numbers that could absorb horrific losses and still maintain combat effectiveness. The Japanese tried to adapt, but faced constraints that made American-style expansion impossible. Fuel became critically scarce after 1942 as American submarines began interdicting tanker traffic from the southern resource zone. Flight training burns enormous quantities of aviation gasoline. As fuel supplies tightened, training hours were cut. By 1943, new Japanese pilots were graduating with 500 flight hours. By early 1944, that number had fallen to 200 hours. By late 1944, many finished with only 40 hours in actual aircraft. Some would receive only 90 hours total by war's end. The quality decline accelerated with each passing month. Saburo Sakai, Japan's third-ranking ace who survived the war with 64 confirmed victories, became a flight instructor in January 1943 after recovering from injuries that had left him partially blind in one eye. He found the new generation of student pilots to be poorly trained and often arrogant despite their lack of skill. In his memoir published after the war, Sakai described the impossible situation instructors faced. Flight training accidents became daily occurrences. Fire engines and ambulances raced down runways constantly to dig pilots out of wrecked aircraft after clumsy takeoffs or landing accidents. The decision to press for quantity over quality meant that inadequately trained flyers graduated to combat units where they faced opponents with double or triple their flight experience. The contrast became mathematically stark. Pre-war Japanese pilots averaged 700 flight hours before seeing combat. American pilots in 1944 averaged 500 hours before combat. New Japanese pilots in early 1944 had 200 hours. By late 1944, some Japanese pilots launched on combat missions with fewer than 40 hours total flight time. The disparity was not just significant, it was catastrophic. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the direct result of the American landing on Saipan on June 15, 1944. For Japan, the Mariana Islands represented the inner defensive perimeter. Saipan lay only 1,200 nautical miles south of Tokyo. B-29 superfortresses operating from Saipan could reach the Japanese home islands with full bomb loads. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet, recognized that if the Americans secured Saipan, strategic bombing would devastate Japanese cities and war production. The fate of the empire, he declared, rests on this one battle. Vice Admiral Jisaburō Ozawa commanded the first mobile fleet from his flagship Taiho, the newest and most heavily armored carrier in the Japanese inventory. Ozawa deployed 9 carriers, 3 fleet carriers, and 6 light carriers, carrying approximately 430 to 450 aircraft. His plan relied on Operation A-Go, which presumed that Japanese carriers operating from longer range could strike American forces while remaining outside the range of American carrier aircraft. Land-based aircraft from Guam and other islands would coordinate with carrier strikes to overwhelm the American fleet. Japanese pilots, Ozawa believed, remained superior to their American counterparts despite the losses at Midway and in the Solomons campaign. Ozawa was tragically mistaken about pilot quality. The veterans who had trained for years before Pearl Harbor were largely dead. What remained were replacement pilots with minimal training facing the most comprehensive pilot training program ever developed. The mathematical reality was brutal. When Japanese pilots with 200 hours of training engaged American pilots with 500 hours of training, the outcome was predetermined. Add to this the American technological advantages in radar-directed fighter control, The proximity fused anti-aircraft shells that detonated within 70 feet of their targets, and aircraft like the F6F Hellcat that were specifically designed to counter the Zero, and the result approached massacre. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58 from the carrier USS Lexington. Under his command were 15 carriers, 7 fleet carriers, and 8 light carriers, carrying approximately 905 aircraft. These carriers were screened by 7 fast battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 13 light cruisers, and 58 destroyers. It was the most powerful naval formation ever assembled. Every ship bristled with radar antennas. Every fighter pilot had been trained to work with fighter directors who used radar to vector them precisely onto incoming enemy formations. The organization worked like a factory assembly line, identifying targets, directing interceptors, and destroying enemy aircraft with industrial efficiency. On the morning of June 19th, American radar detected the first Japanese strike 75 miles out. Fighter directors aboard USS Lexington immediately began vectoring Hellcat fighters to intercept positions. The Japanese formation consisted of 69 aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters flying in loose formation at varying altitudes. They were met 40 miles from the carriers by over 220 F6F Hellcats. The slaughter began immediately. American pilots described the combat as effortless. Japanese formations broke apart under the first attacks. Inexperienced pilots made elementary mistakes, turning into attacks instead of away, failing to maintain defensive formations, losing situational awareness in the chaos of combat. Veteran American pilots recognized immediately that these were not the skilled opponents they had faced 2 years earlier. These were students flying into their first and last combat. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vraciu had already shot down 12 enemy aircraft in previous engagements. Flying from USS Lexington as part of Fighting Squadron 16, he had learned his trade under Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, himself a Medal of Honor recipient who had been killed in action 5 months earlier. O'Hare had taught Vraciu the high side pass for attacking bombers, how to aim for the wing route where fuel tanks concentrated, how to use short-controlled bursts rather than spray ammunition wildly. Vraciu had absorbed every lesson. On the morning of June 19th, Vraciu was flying combat air patrol when he spotted the second Japanese strike wave approaching. He counted approximately 50 Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers in a loose formation below his altitude. They were heading straight for the carrier task force. Despite his malfunctioning supercharger that limited his altitude capability and caused oil to mist across his windshield, Vraciu rolled into his attack. What followed became legendary. Vraciu described seeing the dive bombers spread out like a swarm of bees against the blue water. He maneuvered behind the first bomber and fired a short burst at the wing root and cockpit area. The dive bomber exploded and fell away. He shifted to the second target. Another short burst. Another kill. The third, fourth, and fifth followed in rapid succession. Japanese pilots seemed unaware of the danger behind them. They held formation, making no evasive maneuvers, presenting perfect targets. The sixth kill came with dramatic violence. Vraciu fired into the dive bomber and must have hit its bomb load. The aircraft exploded with tremendous force directly in front of his Hellcat. Vraciu yanked the stick up sharply to avoid flying through the debris. Scattered pieces of the destroyed bomber tumbled past his canopy. In exactly 8 minutes, Vraciu had destroyed 6 enemy aircraft using precisely 60 rounds per kill, demonstrating the extraordinary ammunition efficiency that marked elite pilots. When Vraciu landed back on Lexington, ordnancemen discovered he had fired only 360 rounds from his Hellcat's 2,400-round ammunition capacity. He had averaged less than 5 seconds of firing time per kill. As he climbed from his cockpit, grinning widely, he spotted Vice Admiral Mitcher on the carrier's bridge. Vraciu held up 6 gloved fingers to indicate his score. Mitcher smiled back. A photographer captured the moment, and the image became one of the iconic photographs of American victory in the Pacific. But Vraciu's success was not unique that day. It was merely the most photographed example of what was happening across the entire battle space. Hellcat pilots from every carrier in Task Force 58 were racking up similar scores. The Japanese were not just being defeated, they were being annihilated. The first Japanese strike wave of 69 aircraft suffered devastating losses. Only 27 aircraft returned to their carriers. 42 aircraft, more than 60% of the strike force, were destroyed. The second wave launched by Ozawa consisted of 109 aircraft. They fared no better. American Hellcats tore through the formation. Only 31 aircraft from the second wave returned. 78 aircraft lost. The third wave of 47 aircraft was misdirected, and many planes ran out of fuel searching for the American fleet. Only 7 aircraft from this wave survived. The fourth wave of 87 aircraft launched in the afternoon met similar fate. 30 were shot down over Guam by Hellcats patrolling the island. The remainder attacked the southernmost American carrier group, but inflicted no damage while losing most of their number to anti-aircraft fire and fighters. By the end of June 19th, the Japanese had launched 373 carrier aircraft in 4 waves. Only 130 aircraft returned. 243 carrier aircraft were destroyed in a single day of combat. American losses on June 19th were 23 aircraft. The kill ratio approached 11-1. Japanese pilots who survived described the combat as hopeless. American fighters seemed to be everywhere. Japanese aircraft that penetrated to the carrier screen were met by a curtain of anti-aircraft fire so intense that survival was impossible. The proximity-fused shells detonated within 70 feet of aircraft, filling the sky with lethal shrapnel that shredded aircraft structures and killed pilots before they could press their attacks. While the air battle raged, American submarines struck devastating blows below the surface. At 8:10 a.m., the American submarine USS Albacore, commanded by Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard, fired 6 torpedoes at the Japanese carrier Taiho. Blanchard had maneuvered into an ideal attack position inside the Japanese formation when his fire control computer failed. Forced to fire by eye, he launched all 6 torpedoes in a spread pattern to maximize hit probability. Japanese warrant officer Sakio Komatsu had just launched from Taiho when he spotted a torpedo wake heading directly toward his carrier. Without hesitation, Komatsu deliberately dove his aircraft into the torpedo's path. The explosion destroyed both the torpedo and Komatsu's aircraft, but his sacrifice saved Taiho from one hit. 5 torpedoes remained in the water. 4 missed astern. 1 struck Taiho on the starboard side, rupturing aviation fuel tanks. Initially, the damage appeared minor. Taiho's speed decreased by only 1 knot. The forward elevator jammed in the up position, but flight operations continued. The carrier resumed launching and recovering aircraft. Captain Kikuchi Tomeo believed his ship could continue operations despite the damage. What he did not realize was that aviation gasoline was leaking from the ruptured tanks and filling the hangar decks with explosive vapor. The damage control response proved catastrophically incompetent. An inexperienced damage control officer, attempting to disperse the gasoline fumes, opened all ventilation systems throughout the ship. Instead of venting the vapors overboard, this action spread them throughout Taiho's interior spaces. For 5 hours, gasoline vapor accumulated in concentrations that approached the explosive threshold. At approximately 2:30 p.m., someone threw a switch or struck a spark. The accumulated vapors detonated with catastrophic force. Massive explosions ripped through Taiho from bow to stern. The armored flight deck, designed to withstand bomb hits, bulged upward from the force of the internal blasts. Secondary explosions followed as aviation fuel ignited and munitions cooked off. Admiral Ozawa, recognizing his flagship was doomed, transferred his command staff to the heavy cruiser Haguro. At 4:28 p.m., Taiho rolled over and sank, taking 1,660 men to the bottom. A single torpedo hit, combined with incompetent damage control, had destroyed Japan's newest and most powerful carrier. 3 hours after Albacore struck Taiho, a second American submarine attacked. At 11:18 a.m., USS Kavala, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Herman Kostler, fired 6 torpedoes at the carrier Shokaku from 1,200 yards range. Kostler had maneuvered his submarine into a perfect firing position while Shokaku was recovering aircraft. 3 to 4 torpedoes struck Shokaku's starboard side in 8-second intervals. One hit near the forward bomb magazines and aviation gasoline storage tanks. The damage was immediately catastrophic. Fires erupted throughout the carrier as aviation fuel ignited. Shokaku had been a veteran of Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and the Santa Cruz Islands. She had survived damage in previous battles, but the torpedo hits on June 19th struck in the worst possible locations. At 2:08 p.m., 4 hours after the torpedo hits, an aerial bomb stored in the forward hangar exploded. The blast triggered sympathetic detonations in nearby munitions. Massive explosions tore through the forward section of the ship. 4 minutes later, at 2:12 p.m., Shokaku went vertical, her bow plunging toward the bottom while her stern rose high above the waves. The crew that had assembled on the aft flight deck slid forward into the blazing elevator pit as the ship stood on end. Shokaku sank stern first. Of 2,150 crew members, 1,263 died, including 376 men of Air Group 601. 2 of Japan's most powerful carriers had been destroyed in a single day by submarine attacks that the Japanese screening forces had failed to prevent. The destruction of Taiho and Shokaku, combined with the annihilation of over 240 carrier aircraft, effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as an offensive force. Ozawa still had 7 operational carriers, but he had fewer than 100 operational aircraft remaining. More critically, he had lost most of his trained pilots. The few who survived were demoralized and exhausted. They had witnessed the methodical destruction of their comrades by an enemy who seemed invincible. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the 5th Fleet, made the controversial decision not to pursue Ozawa's retreating force aggressively during the night of June 19th. Spruance's primary mission was to protect the invasion force at Saipan. He remembered Midway, where American carriers had been caught by surprise and nearly destroyed. He chose to maintain position between Ozawa and Saipan rather than pursue into unknown waters at night. This decision has been debated ever since. Critics argue that more aggressive pursuit might have destroyed the entire Japanese carrier force. Defenders note that Spruance accomplished his mission. The invasion fleet remained protected, and Japan's carrier aviation was effectively destroyed regardless of whether the carriers themselves were sunk. On June 20th, Mitscher launched a long-range strike against the retreating Japanese fleet. At approximately 4:20 p.m., 216 American aircraft launched from Task Force 58 carriers, knowing they would have to return after dark. The strike force traveled 275 miles to reach the Japanese fleet near the limit of their combat radius. They sank the carrier Hio and damaged several other vessels. 80 American aircraft were lost in the mission, primarily from fuel exhaustion during the night recovery, operations rather than enemy action. Pilots who ran out of fuel ditched in the ocean, trusting that rescue operations would find them. Most were recovered. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, represented a decisive turning point. Japan lost approximately 600 aircraft over 2 days. 3 carriers were sunk. More critically, Japan lost most of its remaining trained carrier pilots. Subsequent battles would see Japanese carriers present but unable to conduct effective operations due to lack of qualified aircrews. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japanese carriers served primarily as decoys because they had so few trained pilots that carrier operations were no longer viable. The decisive battle Japanese doctrine had anticipated for decades had occurred, and Japan had lost catastrophically. The young Americans who flew from Task Force 58 on June 19th represented something unprecedented in military history. They were products of industrial age total war, mass-produced warriors created through standardized training programs, scaled to volumes that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. They were individually competent rather than exceptionally skilled, but there were so many of them, so well equipped, so thoroughly supported by industrial production that individual skill gaps became irrelevant. The training infrastructure replaced losses faster than combat could inflict them. Experienced pilots rotated into teaching billets to keep instruction current. Combat lessons were incorporated into training doctrine within weeks. This approach worked because it was designed from the first day to operate at the scale modern warfare demanded. The Japanese pilots who died over the Philippine Sea were victims of strategic decisions made years before the battle. They were brave. They were committed. Many showed individual courage that deserved respect. But they were products of a training philosophy that had worked brilliantly for 50 years, but had become obsolete the moment sustained combat began producing casualties faster than the program could replace them with equivalent quality. No amount of courage could compensate for insufficient training. No amount of dedication could overcome the simple reality that 40 to 200 flight hours did not produce pilots capable of matching opponents with 500 hours. The Grumman F6F Hellcat proved itself as perhaps the most successful fighter aircraft of the Pacific War. Powered by a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, the Hellcat could reach speeds of 380 miles per hour and had a combat radius of 380 miles. Armed with 650 caliber machine guns carrying 2,400 rounds total, it could deliver devastating firepower. The Hellcat was rugged, could absorb significant battle damage and continue flying, and was designed specifically to counter the Zero's advantages in maneuverability by emphasizing speed, armor protection, and firepower. The Hellcat would account for 75% of U.S. Navy aerial victories in the Pacific War and achieved an overall kill ratio of 19-1. Against the Zero specifically, the Hellcat's kill ratio was 13-1. The Mitsubishi A6M0, which had dominated the early years of the Pacific War, was by 1944 essentially obsolete. Powered by an approximately 1,000 horsepower Nakajima Sakai engine, the Zero had excellent range, approximately 600 miles combat radius, and superb maneuverability. Armed with two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns, it could deliver lethal firepower. But the Zero's advantages came at a cost. It lacked armor protection for the pilot. It lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. Any hit that penetrated to fuel tanks or pilot would likely prove fatal. Against well-trained opponents in rugged aircraft like the Hellcat, the Zero's advantages became irrelevant. More critically, by June 1944, there were no longer pilots capable of exploiting the Zero's performance characteristics. The Japanese had some of the finest aircraft designers in the world. New designs, like the Kawanishi N1K Shiden, offered performance superior to the Hellcat, but these aircraft entered service too late and in too few numbers. More importantly, there were no longer pilots trained to fly them effectively. The aircraft existed, the pilots did not. Alexander Vraciu would shoot down his 19th and final aircraft on June 20th during the strike against Ozawa's fleet, making him the Navy's leading ace at that moment, though he would hold that title for only 4 months as other pilots surpassed his total. He was nominated for the Medal of Honor for his actions during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but received the Navy Cross instead. In August 1944, he returned to the United States for a war bond tour and married Catherine Horn on August 24th. He spent several months promoting war bonds and working with Grumman aircraft on fighter development before insisting on returning to combat. In December 1944, flying with Fighting Squadron 20 from USS Lexington, Vraciu was shot down by anti-aircraft fire over the Philippines during his second combat mission after returning to the Pacific. He parachuted safely and was rescued by Filipino guerrilla fighters, who appointed him commander of a guerrilla unit of approximately 180 men. Vraciu spent 5 weeks moving through Japanese-occupied territory with his guerrilla force before making contact with American forces in January 1945. He returned to USS Lexington, carrying a Japanese sword given to him by the guerrillas and leading his unit into American lines. Vraciu spent the final months of the war as a test pilot at the Naval Air Test Center at Patuxent River, Maryland. He ended World War II as the U.S. Navy's 4th-ranking ace with 19 aerial victories and 21 aircraft destroyed on the ground. After the war, he was promoted to lieutenant commander and served 6 years as a test pilot. He was instrumental in forming the post-war Naval and Marine Air Reserve program. He commanded Fighting Squadron 51 from 1956 to 1958, winning the Navy's Individual Gunnery Championship in 1957. He retired from the Navy with the rank of commander on December 31, 1963. After retirement, Vraciu moved to Danville, California and worked for Wells Fargo Bank. His life and career were chronicled in Ray Boomhauer's 2010 book Fighter Pilot, The World War II Career of Alex Vraciu. Vraciu attended reunions of Pacific War veterans and spoke at military events throughout his later life. He died on January 29, 2015, at the age of 96, long enough to see his famous photograph from June 19, 1944, recognized as one of the iconic images of American victory in the Pacific. But Vraciu always insisted that June 19th was not about individual heroics. It was about competing philosophies of warfare, America's industrial model overwhelming Japan's artisan approach. In numerous interviews over the decades, he emphasized that he had simply done his job. The real story, he believed, was the industrial capacity that produced Hellcats by the thousands, trained pilots by the tens of thousands, and created the logistical infrastructure that kept carriers supplied with fuel, ammunition, and aircraft halfway across the Pacific Ocean. The statistics from the Battle of the Philippine Sea tell the mathematical story with brutal clarity. Task Force 58 deployed approximately 900 aircraft flown by pilots averaging over 500 flight hours. Japanese carriers launched approximately 430 aircraft flown by pilots, averaging under 250 flight hours in early 1944, with many late 1944 pilots having only 40 hours. American pilots claimed over 380 Japanese aircraft destroyed on June 19th alone. Japanese pilots claimed to have destroyed over 100 American aircraft. The actual American losses were 23. The disparity between Japanese perception and reality demonstrated how completely Japanese pilots had lost situational awareness in combat. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. Japanese pilots who survived knew they were outmatched. They knew their training was inadequate. They knew they were being sent to die against opponents they could not defeat. Morale collapsed throughout Japanese naval aviation. Some pilots developed psychosomatic illnesses to avoid combat duty. Others flew their assigned missions but avoided engagement whenever possible, returning to report enemy contact but accomplishing nothing. The fighting spirit that had characterized Japanese naval aviation in 1941 and 1942 was gone, replaced by resignation and despair. By 1945, Japan was reduced to using inexperienced pilots in kamikaze attacks because no other form of aerial combat remained viable. The kamikaze was not a cultural choice reflecting Japanese martial spirit. It was an admission that Japanese pilot training had failed so completely that pilots could no longer be trained to return from missions. Training someone to fly an airplane into a ship required only a few weeks. Training someone to be a combat pilot required months or years that Japan no longer had. Japan's fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. Training facilities were being bombed. Experienced instructors were dead or flying combat missions. The training pipeline had completely collapsed. The final irony was that Japan possessed the industrial capacity to build excellent aircraft, but lacked the capacity to train pilots to fly them. The Kawanishi N-1K Shiden that entered service in late 1944 was in many respects superior to the F6F Hellcat. It was faster, more maneuverable, and carried heavier armament. But it entered service too late and in numbers too small to affect the war's outcome. More critically, the few Shidens that reached operational squadrons were flown by pilots with minimal training who could not exploit the aircraft's capabilities. Superior technology meant nothing without trained operators. American pilots who survived June 19th went on to dominate Pacific skies for the remainder of the war. They struck targets across the Philippines, Formosa, Okinawa, and eventually Japan itself. They faced increasing desperation from Japanese forces, but decreasing competence from Japanese pilots. By 1945, American carrier pilots described shooting down Japanese aircraft as little more than target practice. The opposition had no skills, no tactics, no hope. They flew because they were ordered to fly, and they died because they lacked the training to survive combat against opponents who had everything they lacked. The battle had lasted less than 10 hours of actual aerial combat on June 19th. Its consequences would shape the remainder of the Pacific War. Japan never again contested American naval aviation dominance. The carrier forces that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, that had represented Japanese hopes for victory through superior skill and courage, had been destroyed not by American courage or superior individual skill, but by American industrial capacity applied to mass training programs. The Turkey Shoot was not won by ace pilots making brilliant individual decisions. It was won by adequate pilots following standardized procedures, supported by superior equipment, enabled by training programs that could produce replacements faster than combat could destroy them. Vraciu's 6 kills in 8 minutes represented exceptional performance within a framework designed to generate consistent results. Other pilots scored 3 kills, 4 kills, 5 kills that day. The cumulative effect was the same. Japanese naval aviation was destroyed as an offensive force. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vraciu, holding up 6 fingers on the deck of the Lexington, remains the enduring image of June 19, 1944. But the larger story was playing out in training facilities across America, where thousands more pilots, just like Vraciu, were learning the skills that would carry them through combat. The larger story was in the wreckage of Japanese training programs that could no longer produce pilots fast enough or well enough to matter. The larger story was in the mathematics of attrition, where American pilot production exceeded American pilot losses, while Japanese pilot losses exceeded Japanese pilot production by margins that made victory impossible. The human cost of the Battle of the Philippine Sea extended far beyond the pilots lost in combat. Aboard Taiho, 1,660 men died when the carrier exploded and sank. Most were trapped below decks when the catastrophic explosions tore through the ship. There was no time to abandon ship properly. Men who reached the flight deck found themselves thrown into the water as the carrier rolled over. Many were pulled down by the suction as 33,000 tons of steel plunged toward the ocean floor. Destroyers rescued approximately 500 survivors from the water, but over 1,200 men went down with the ship. Aboard Shokaku, the casualties were equally horrific. 1,263 men died out of a crew of 2,150. The carrier sank so quickly after the final explosions that organized abandonment was impossible. Crew members assembled on the aft flight deck found themselves sliding forward into the blazing elevator pit as the ship went vertical. Those who jumped into the water faced burning fuel oil spreading across the surface. Some men survived the sinking only to die from their injuries or exposure before rescue ships could reach them. The survivors who were picked up by destroyers had witnessed the violent death of one of Japan's most famous warships, a carrier that had participated in nearly every major battle of the Pacific War until that day. The loss of so many experienced sailors compounded Japan's problems. Naval aviators received attention, but the ship's crews who maintained aircraft, operated radar and communications equipment, handled damage control, and managed flight operations were equally irreplaceable. These men had years of experience. They knew their ships intimately. They worked together as teams that functioned with the efficiency that only comes from long practice. When Taiho and Shokaku sank, Japan lost not only the carriers themselves, but the institutional knowledge embodied in their crews. Replacement crews on other carriers would lack this experience, making operations less efficient and more prone to accidents. The American submarine force that had sunk Taiho and Shokaku represented another dimension of American industrial and tactical superiority. USS Albacore and USS Kavala were Gato-class submarines, part of a production run that would eventually total 77 boats. These submarines displaced 1,525 tons surfaced, carried crews of 60 to 80 men, and were armed with 10 21-inch torpedo tubes. They could dive to depths of 300 feet and remain submerged for extended periods. Their diesel-electric propulsion systems gave them surface speeds of 20 knots and submerged speeds of 9 knots. More importantly, American submarines operated as part of an integrated intelligence and logistics network that Japanese anti-submarine forces could rarely match. Ultra-intercepts provided American submarines with advance warning of Japanese fleet movements. Long-range patrol aircraft spotted Japanese formations and radioed positions to submarines. Submarine tender ships provided fuel, torpedoes, and supplies at forward bases, allowing submarines to remain on station for extended periods. The entire infrastructure worked with industrial efficiency, positioning submarines where they could inflict maximum damage on Japanese naval forces. Japanese anti-submarine capabilities had improved since the early war years, but remained inadequate to protect high-value targets like carriers. Destroyers carried depth charges and could conduct sonar searches, but lacked the persistence and coordination to effectively screen carrier formations against skilled submarine commanders. The destroyers escorting Taiho dropped depth charges on USS Albacore after the attack, but caused only minor damage. The destroyers escorting Shokaku pounded USS Kavala with 105 depth charge explosions over 3 hours, but failed to sink or even seriously damage the submarine. Both submarines escaped and continued their patrols, with Albacore going on to complete her mission and Kavala remaining on station until ordered home in late July. The failure of Japanese screening forces to protect carriers from submarine attack reflected broader problems in Japanese anti-submarine warfare. Japan had entered the war focused on offensive operations, carrier strikes, and surface combat. Defensive operations like convoy escort and anti-submarine warfare received minimal attention and resources. This proved catastrophic as American submarines systematically destroyed Japanese merchant shipping throughout the war. By June 1944, American submarines had sunk millions of tons of Japanese merchant shipping, crippling Japan's ability to import raw materials from occupied territories and distribute resources within the home islands. The parallels between Japanese failures in anti-submarine warfare and failures in pilot training were obvious. Both reflected a focus on offensive operations and individual excellence at the expense of the unglamorous but essential support functions that modern warfare demanded. Japan trained superb attack pilots, but failed to train adequate numbers of transport pilots, maintenance personnel, and logistics specialists. Japan built powerful battleships and carriers, but failed to build enough convoy escorts, oilers, and repair ships. The pattern repeated across every dimension of Japanese military operations, and the cumulative effect was decisive. Task Force 58's operations after the Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated the confidence American forces had gained. The carriers continued supporting the Saipan invasion through June and into July, launching strikes against Japanese positions on the island and providing air cover for ground forces. American pilots flew combat air patrols, close air support missions, and strikes against Japanese reinforcements with casual efficiency. Opposition was minimal. Japanese air power in the Marianas had been effectively destroyed. In July 1944, Task Force 58 struck targets across the Western Pacific. Carriers launched raids against the Bonin Islands, Iwo Jima, and Guam. They supported the invasions of Guam and Tinian. They interdicted Japanese shipping and struck airfields from which Japanese bombers might threaten American forces. The carriers operated with virtual impunity. Japanese air attacks were rare and ineffective. The few Japanese aircraft that did attack were easily shot down by combat air patrols or anti-aircraft fire. The organized destruction of Japanese air power continued through the fall of 1944. During the invasion of the Philippines in October, American carriers again faced Japanese opposition, but the pattern established at the Battle of the Philippine Sea repeated. Japanese pilots were poorly trained, poorly coordinated, and unable to penetrate American defenses effectively. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, saw Japanese carriers present but unable to conduct offensive operations due to lack of trained pilots. The carriers served as decoys, deliberately sacrificing themselves to draw American forces away from the landing beaches. It was a mission that admitted defeat, using carriers as expendable bait because they could no longer function as offensive weapons. The kamikaze attacks that emerged during the Philippines campaign represented Japan's final admission that conventional naval aviation was no longer viable. If pilots could not be trained to fight and return, they would be trained to die attacking their targets. Kamikaze tactics inflicted significant damage on American forces, sinking dozens of ships and damaging hundreds more. But kamikaze attacks were fundamentally defensive, attempts to make invasion so costly that Americans would negotiate rather than continue advancing. They could not win the war. They could only increase the price Americans paid for victory. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot fundamentally changed how military planners thought about air combat. The battle demonstrated that numerical and technological advantages, combined with superior training, could produce results that approached annihilation. The 11-to-1 kill ratio on June 19th was unprecedented in modern warfare. It suggested that with sufficient advantages in training, equipment, and tactical organization, one side could achieve air superiority so complete that the enemy ceased to be a meaningful factor. This lesson would influence air combat doctrine for decades. The importance of radar-directed fighter control became obvious. The value of rugged, heavily armed fighters over nimble but fragile opponents was confirmed. The necessity of comprehensive training, programs that produced pilots in large numbers, became clear. Nations that learned these lessons would dominate air combat in subsequent conflicts. Nations that ignored these lessons would repeat Japan's mistakes. The Battle of the Philippine Sea also demonstrated the importance of integrated naval operations. American success on June 19th came from the coordination of carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, radar installations, communications networks, and logistics support. No single element won the battle. The integrated force won the battle. Japanese forces, organized around carrier striking power with inadequate support functions, could not match American coordinated operations even when individual Japanese ships or aircraft performed well. The human dimension of the battle deserves emphasis. The young Japanese pilots who died on June 19th were not monsters or fanatics. They were teenagers and young men in their 20s who had been drafted into military service and given minimal training before being sent into combat against overwhelming opposition. Many understood they were going to die. Some wrote farewell letters to families before launching on missions they knew were suicidal. They flew anyway because their culture demanded it, because they had been taught that death in service to the emperor was the highest honor, because refusing to fly meant shame for themselves and their families. These young men deserved better than to be sacrificed in a war their nation could not win by leaders who refused to acknowledge reality. The failure was not theirs. The failure belonged to the Japanese military and political leadership that had started a war without understanding their opponent's capabilities, that had designed training infrastructure inadequate for modern warfare's demands, and that refused to seek peace even after defeat became mathematically certain. The pilots who died at the Battle of the Philippine Sea were victims of these failures. Similarly, the young Americans who fought on June 19th were products of their nation's choices. Most were volunteers who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, motivated by patriotism and desire to serve. They came from cities and farms across America. They represented every region and many ethnic backgrounds. What united them was the training framework that had transformed them from civilians into naval aviators, capable of fighting and winning against determined opponents. These men were not naturally superior to their Japanese counterparts. They were not braver or more skilled by nature. They were better trained, better equipped, and better supported by the logistical and industrial infrastructure that allowed them to focus on flying and fighting rather than worrying about fuel, ammunition, or maintenance. The framework created their advantage, and the framework delivered their victory. Alexander Vraciu's famous photograph, holding up 6 fingers and grinning widely after his extraordinary combat performance, captured something essential about the American war effort. Vraciu was proud of his achievement, and rightly so. Shooting down 6 aircraft in 8 minutes required exceptional skill and courage. But his grin was not cruel or triumphant over defeated enemies. It was the grin of a young man who had done his job well, who had protected his carrier and his shipmates, who had survived combat and would live to fight another day. The photograph showed confidence without arrogance, skill without cruelty, victory without hatred. That image, more than any tactical analysis or statistical summary, explains why America won the Pacific War. American forces were confident because they had reason for confidence. They were supported by industrial capacity that Japan could not match. They were trained by programs designed to produce competent pilots in large numbers. They were equipped with aircraft and weapons that gave them significant advantages. They fought not from desperation or fanaticism, but from professional competence backed by overwhelming material superiority. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not America's most important naval battle. Midway probably deserves that distinction for stopping Japanese expansion and shifting the war's momentum. But the Turkey Shoot was the most one-sided demonstration of American superiority, the clearest proof that Japan had lost the capacity to contest American advances, the mathematical confirmation that continuing the war was futile. The Battle of the Philippine Sea proved that modern war rewards the nation that can train adequate warriors by the thousands over the nation that trains elite warriors by the dozens. Japan had built its strategy around quality, around the decisive battle where superior skill would triumph. America had built its strategy around quantity, around the long war where superior industrial capacity would eventually overwhelm any opponent. June 19, 1944, demonstrated which strategy matched the realities of industrial age warfare. Japan's military leadership had assumed that spirit could overcome material, that courage could defeat production capacity, that a few years of brutal training could create warriors capable of matching any opponent. These assumptions were rooted in centuries of samurai tradition and recent successes in China and the early Pacific campaigns. But they were fundamentally wrong in the context of total industrial war between major powers. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot demonstrated this reality with mathematical precision. American industrial capacity, applied methodically to training and production, created military capabilities that Japanese courage and skill could not match. The battle's significance extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. It demonstrated to Japanese leadership that continuing the war was futile. American carrier forces could operate with impunity across the Pacific. American air power would soon devastate Japanese cities. American submarines had already crippled Japanese merchant shipping. The industrial gap between the United States and Japan, always vast, had become an unbridgeable chasm. Every month that the war continued would see American advantages increase while Japanese capabilities decreased. Yet the war would continue for another 14 months after the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japanese leadership, unable to accept the implications of their defeat, would commit the nation to a defense that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The tragedy of the Battle of the Philippine Sea was not just the immediate casualties, but the clear demonstration that those casualties achieved nothing. Japan did not save Saipan. Japan did not stop American advances. Japan did not buy time to negotiate better peace terms. The sacrifice of over 600 aircraft and 3,000 sailors accomplished nothing except to demonstrate how completely Japan had lost the capacity to wage modern naval warfare effectively. The Battle of the Philippine Sea stands as testament to the decisive nature of industrial capacity in modern warfare. Japan's defeat was not inevitable from the war's first day, but it became inevitable when Japanese leaders failed to build the industrial and training infrastructure necessary to sustain modern warfare. The Turkey Shoot was simply the moment when mathematical reality became undeniable, when the gap between Japanese capabilities and American capabilities manifested in such one-sided combat that no one could ignore or minimize the disparity. For students of military history, the Battle of the Philippine Sea offers clear lessons. Training matters more than individual courage. industrial capacity matters more than martial tradition. Technological advantages matter more than fighting spirit. Integrated operations matter more than isolated excellence. Nations that understand these factors and organize their societies to maximize these advantages will prevail in modern warfare. Nations that rely on courage, individual skill, or spirit to overcome material disadvantages will lose. The lesson is clear, the evidence is overwhelming, and the results are decisive. The strategic planning that led to the Battle of the Philippine Sea revealed fundamental differences in how America and Japan approached warfare. Admiral Spruance's Fifth Fleet operated under clear strategic priorities: protect the invasion forces at Saipan, destroy Japanese naval air power, and if opportunity permitted, sink Japanese carriers. Spruance never deviated from these priorities, even when tactical opportunities tempted more aggressive action. His conservative approach frustrated some subordinates who wanted to pursue Ozawa's fleet more aggressively on the night of June 19th. But Spruance understood that his primary mission was protecting the amphibious forces, not chasing enemy carriers into unknown waters in darkness. Japanese planning, by contrast, reflected the persistent belief that one decisive battle could reverse the war's momentum. Operation A-Go was designed around this assumption. If Japanese carriers could coordinate with land-based aircraft to strike American carriers simultaneously from multiple directions, the resulting damage might force American withdrawal from the Marianas. The plan required precise timing, effective coordination between carrier and land-based forces, and pilots capable of pressing home attacks against heavy opposition. None of these prerequisites existed on June 19th. Admiral Ozawa's decision to launch strikes from extreme range on June 19th reflected his confidence in Japanese pilot capabilities. Japanese carriers could theoretically strike from ranges that American carriers could not match because the Zero's superior range allowed attacks from greater distances. In practice, the range advantage meant nothing when Japanese pilots could not execute effective attacks even when they reached their targets. The reality that Ozawa discovered on June 19th was that range meant nothing without trained pilots. Japanese aircraft launched from extreme range, flew for hours over open ocean, located the American fleet, pressed through fighter opposition and anti-aircraft fire, and then had to return across hundreds of miles of ocean to carriers that might no longer be where they expected. This profile demanded navigation skills, fuel management discipline, and tactical judgment that Japanese pilots with minimal training simply did not possess. Many Japanese aircraft that survived the attacks were lost on the return flight when pilots became disoriented, ran out of fuel, or misjudged their carrier's position. American carrier doctrine emphasized shorter-range strikes with aircraft that had fuel reserves adequate for combat and safe return. American pilots knew they could reach their carriers after combat because American operations kept strike ranges within conservative limits that ensured adequate fuel margins. The contrast between American fuel discipline and Japanese fuel desperation was stark on June 19th. American pilots engaged in extended combat, returned to their carriers, refueled, and launched again. Japanese pilots who survived the initial attacks often lacked fuel for extended combat or safe return. The technological advantages that American forces enjoyed on June 19th extended beyond aircraft performance. American radar could detect incoming raids at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Fighter directors could vector interceptors to precise positions using radar tracking. Communications networks allowed coordination between carriers, between fighter directors and pilots, between ships and aircraft. Japanese radar technology existed but was not integrated into operations with American effectiveness. The technological gap was not primarily about individual pieces of equipment, but about the infrastructure and training that allowed technology to be used effectively. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated that modern naval warfare demanded capabilities across multiple dimensions. Air power was necessary but not sufficient. Submarines were effective but required intelligence and coordination. Surface ships needed protection from air attack. Logistics determined operational tempo. Intelligence affected tactical decisions. Training determined pilot effectiveness. Technology provided advantages but required skilled operators. No single factor determined victory. Success required excellence across the entire spectrum of naval capabilities. American forces had achieved this comprehensive excellence. Japanese forces had not. The implications for future naval warfare were profound. The battle demonstrated that carrier aviation had become the decisive element of naval power. Battleships, which had dominated naval thinking for decades, were relegated to anti-aircraft platforms and shore bombardment duties. Surface ships existed primarily to protect carriers and support amphibious operations. Submarines could devastate enemy forces but could not control sea areas. Air power was supreme, and the nation that could project superior air power across ocean distances would dominate naval warfare. But the battle also demonstrated that carrier aviation required far more than carriers and aircraft. It required trained pilots in large numbers. It required effective training programs that could produce those pilots. It required industrial capacity to build carriers and aircraft faster than combat could destroy them. It required logistics to support operations far from bases. It required technology to find and track enemies. It required doctrine that integrated all these elements effectively. Carrier aviation was not just about carriers, it was about industrial societies organizing their entire productive capacity to support naval air power. Japan had failed to understand this reality. Japanese leaders had assumed that superior pilots flying superior aircraft from a limited number of carriers could defeat numerically superior, but presumably inferior American forces. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. American pilots were not inferior. American training produced competent pilots in numbers that Japanese training could not match. American aircraft were not inferior. The Hellcat was specifically designed to counter the Zero's advantages and succeeded brilliantly. American carriers were not inferior. They were built in numbers that allowed losses to be absorbed and replaced. Every Japanese assumption about relative capabilities proved wrong, and the mathematical consequences of these errors became undeniable on June 19, 1944. The legacy of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot extended far beyond World War II. The battle established principles that would govern naval aviation for decades. Comprehensive training programs became standard in all modern navies. Mass production of adequate aircraft replaced artisan production of theoretically superior designs. Integrated operations combining multiple capabilities became doctrine. The lessons of June 19, 1944 were studied, analyzed, and incorporated into naval thinking worldwide. The battle became a case study in how industrial powers wage modern warfare and how nations that fail to adapt to industrial warfare's demands face inevitable defeat. The young men who fought on June 19, 1944 paid with their lives to teach these lessons. Japanese pilots died because their nation's leaders had made strategic errors years before the battle. American pilots survived because their nation had made better strategic choices. The difference was not courage or skill or dedication. The difference was strategic vision, industrial capacity, and the ability to organize society for total war. These factors, not individual heroism, determined the battle's outcome. The lesson is harsh but clear. Modern warfare rewards nations that understand industrial age realities and punish nations that cling to pre-industrial assumptions about warfare. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot proved this reality beyond any doubt.